Chris Lynch with ePark Canterbury. Park at 264 Russell Road and go in the draw to win a trip to Samoa. eParkcanterbury.co.nz.
Toby Young, thanks so much for your time.
No problem, Chris.
I read an opinion piece in the Telegraph, I think it was entitled, Why the Left Needs to Learn to Love Toby Young. Do you think the left do need to learn to love you?
Well, I think the free speech should be as important to the left as it is to people on the right. And that's been a long-running argument. I think the difficulty that some pro-Palestinian protesters have got into has been quite helpful in that respect. So lots of people on the left, particularly the radical progressive left, who've embraced the Palestinian cause in the last 9 months or so, they were the same people claiming that there was no free speech crisis. It was just an invention of right-wing culture warriors. And now I think they've discovered actually that free speech is important after all, because they found themselves getting into trouble for chanting things like "from the river to the sea." One good thing to come out of this is that the left, I think, has rediscovered that free speech should be as valuable to them as it is to people like us.
So why is it, as that article pointed out, that, and the article was bang on when it said the left now regards campaigns to defend free speech as constructs of the right, which must be therefore banished or opposed? What's gone wrong, do you think? Because the left used to be the champions of free speech, and all of a sudden they're not.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that the left championed free speech when the establishment, the authorities, the courts were, broadly speaking, conservative with a small c. Now that the establishment, the authorities, the court are, for the most part, woke and progressive, they no longer value free speech as much because they don't need it. They can say whatever they like. They're not going to get into trouble because all the people in authority, including the police, are on the same side as them. But it's quite short-sighted to abandon free speech because, the wind can change and then they'll need it just as much as we need it now.
The Free Speech Union here in New Zealand, who's brought you to New Zealand, celebrated, of course, that decision by the Department of Internal Affairs to abandon those heavy proposals to regulate online speech. Is that a win for free speech in your view, or something else? Because it was the Department of Internal Affairs and unelected bureaucrats that were pushing for stronger regulations across all media online.
I think it was a big win for free speech and a real achievement of the New Zealand Free Speech Union. There have been numerous attempts, not just in New Zealand, but across the English-speaking world and beyond, to try and regulate social media and cleanse social media of what the regulators refer to as misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. But often that's just code for an unorthodox point of view, which I disagree with. It's kind of what they really object to are the values of a certain section of the population. They don't like populist, right-wing commentators or comments. And they, instead of engaging in an honest, grown-up argument about why they think their values are better than those of the populist right, they find it easier to just describe anything they say as misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech and try and get it removed rather than actually have a grown-up discussion. And that's been the reaction. I think all these efforts to censor social media, what the American writers Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi describe as the censorship industrial complex, and this was just one facet of it in New Zealand, they all seem to stem from the populist victories in 2016, the victory of Donald Trump in the US presidential election in 2016 and the victory of Vote Leave in the EU referendum in the UK. But the global elite, the people in power, instead of thinking, crikey, maybe globalism isn't all we claimed for it, maybe there are some costs, instead of confronting that argument and having that debate in the public square and making an honest case for what it is they believe, they decided to blame those populist victories on bad actors misinforming the credulous electorates. And so their response was to try and suppress that kind of dissent. And I fear that the success of various populist parties in the European elections last week will have a similar effect. So the EU powers that be will conclude not that they need to make the case for the values they believe in more strongly and persuade more people to embrace their policy agenda. No, they'll conclude that once again the public have been led astray by bad actors, and we have to shut those bad actors down. We have to silence them. That's the only way we can cling on to our power.
And in order to do that, in order to achieve that, you use that word that I can't stand, and that's disinformation or misinformation. And I know particularly in the UK, here in New Zealand, and ironically in the US, there was the formation and still is the formation of disinformation organisations that appear to be in the main, in my view, quite far left. Why is that? I mean, you've kind of pointed out that that's the case, but don't you think, though, the tide's slightly turning and people are now realising that these so-called experts that appear on mainstream television are just that? They're not actually experts. They have a political agenda.
Yes, I think people are waking up to that in greater and greater numbers. And that's why you see people less likely to read mainstream legacy newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post in the United States, the Guardian in the UK, and turn away from mainstream television news channels like the BBC, CNN. There's been a sort of rapid decline in trust, I think, particularly since the lockdowns were rolled out and then the vaccines in 2020 and 2021. And people are going elsewhere to find their news, going to sources they trust more in the kind of alternative media sphere. I run this news publishing site called the Daily Skeptic, which is one such news source, but there are many, and it's a growing ecology. And one of the reasons I think that there's a kind of moral panic about misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech being disseminated on these alt media channels, even though, it's not, it's really the mainstream media panicking about the fact that they are rapidly losing eyeballs to these alternative channels. And the way to win back, that trust is to be more scrupulous about how they report the news, be less credulous about regurgitating the kind of, regime propaganda. That's why people have lost trust in those mainstream media sources. And I think there's a dawning of realization at the New York Times and the Washington Post, CNN, perhaps not the BBC, that they do need to restore some of that impartiality, some of that objectivity. They need to improve their reporting standards, hold themselves to higher standards if they're going to win back that trust, not just denigrate alternative media sources as being kind of full of fake news.
It's interesting you say this because the parallels that you speak of, I'm sure you probably know, happened here in New Zealand. The trust in, not all of course, but legacy media is at an all-time low, and that follows a global trend, particularly following the lockdowns, particularly following the COVID-19 pandemic. We had mainstream media that was essentially propping up government messages by running campaigns saying, get the jab, and what was the campaign called now? The New Zealand Herald ran a campaign, encouraging people to get vaccinated. You had another media organisation here in New Zealand that would actually door knock a former Christchurch City Councillor senior manager because he chose not to be vaccinated. They treated him like he was either a murderer or a paedophile, and they door knocked him and put his photo on the front page of the paper. We had other mainstream journalists on Twitter calling for members of the New Zealand public to dob in cafes they felt had too many people in that. I mean, that is such dangerous stuff, and I think people can see that for what it was. I want to pick up on that as well, because you're one of the first journalists in the UK to criticise lockdowns, for better or worse, suggesting they might cause more harm than good. From everything we know now that's coming out, do you feel somewhat vindicated, Toby?
I do, yeah. I was one of a tiny handful of English journalists who criticised the lockdown policy from the very beginning, thought it was a terrible idea. it would inevitably cause far more harm than good, and was ridiculed at the time, was accused of endangering people's lives. Various mainstream journalists said I would have blood on my hands because I was expressing skepticism about the need for a lockdown. I do feel vindicated 4 years later.
I wouldn't have felt comfortable having this conversation with you 2 years ago, to be honest with you, because I don't think any of us wanted to be called anti-jab or anti-this or anti-that. But what I find interesting now, Toby, when I talk to specialists, even medical experts here in my home city of Christchurch, they've admitted to me that they got the vaccination not for health reasons, but to keep their job. What a thing to actually have to admit. And,
Yeah, no, that is, I think the way in which people were coerced into getting vaccinated through various means, vaccine passports, making it a condition of continuing to work, making it a condition of returning to a university, and so on, attending sporting events and so on and so forth. All of that was abhorrent, a grotesque interference in our freedom. And of course, the authorities, the mainstream media, public health officials wildly oversold the vaccines. They overstated their efficacy and underplayed the various side effects. And I think people who have experienced some of those adverse reactions are now justifiably furious that they were essentially strong-armed into taking what was a fast-tracked, I don't want to call it experimental, but it was certainly a new, untested drug or collection of drugs, and they were coerced into taking them effectively. And now some people are suffering as a consequence. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing a backlash against incumbents who were in place when the lockdowns were rolled out and vaccines were rolled out the following year, one of the reasons we're seeing this reaction is because I think people are waking up to the fact that they were manipulated and coerced into behaving in a way which was unnecessary and which may, in fact, now place them in far greater danger than they actually were back in 2020.
It's incredible, though, how powerful governments around the world were able to, I guess in some respects, Toby, instill some sense of fear and shame in people. Do you worry that future authoritarian governments could try lockdowns again, or do you think that moment has passed? I mean, I'll just give you an example. No doubt you've heard it before. It's a famous one. We had our own Prime Minister at the time telling New Zealanders not to talk to their neighbours.
I was shocked by how willing the populations of the UK, of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, shocked by how willing they were to comply with these draconian, authoritarian state diktats. I used to think that Nazism could never have taken root in Britain in the 1930s in the way it did in Germany, because there was something unique about the British which made them immune to those sorts of authoritarian movements. I think George Orwell famously said that no goose-stepping soldier would ever have any authority in the UK because people, on seeing the goose-stepping soldier, would just burst out laughing. But actually, turns out the British were more than willing to go along with an extraordinarily authoritarian series of diktats. And not only that, they became collaborators. They dobbed people in. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people called the police to report on their neighbours. Well, their neighbours weren't complying with these absurd rules. And it does alarm me. I think that effectively the authorities, various political leaders, have discovered that they can do this. And of course, the risk now is that they'll do it again. I think it's unlikely that we'll see another lockdown in the next year or so, because we're still recovering from the colossal economic damage done by the lockdowns around the world. I mean, the reason Rishi Sunak is about to lose the British general election is partly because the British economy still hasn't recovered from the 400 billion plus rescue package that the government spent on furlough, on paying people to stay at home and not work. So I think any government would be wary of imposing another lockdown, given the parlous state that most economies across the West are in because of the first few lockdowns. But I think in a few years' time, if there is another virus, even a virus that's no more lethal than COVID-19, yes, I'm afraid there could easily be another lockdown. There's been a refusal to really reckon with the consequences of the policy, a refusal to properly weigh up the pros and cons.
Even when you just pointed out to me, the Dobbin lines, I mean, that's so scary. We had the same thing in New Zealand where you could, if you thought somebody may have been breaking those rules, you could call that 0800 number and report them. It's scary stuff. I could talk to you all day, but I do want to ask perhaps a final question, Toby. And I was watching your video on Twitter the other day. I mean, Scotland's hate speech laws, in some respects, they seem to have sort of backfired, because I know you've got, thousands more subscribers to the Free Speech Union UK. Are you surprised by this? Do you think they will actually backfire more to the point where legislation says, actually, no, you can't tell me how to think?
Amongst the general public, these sorts of draconian restrictions on what we can and can't say, the obsessive policing of our speech, is becoming increasingly unpopular. So in that respect, we are seeing a backlash. But there isn't much evidence that the authorities are responding to this by relaxing those kind of restrictions. I mean, there is a very similar bill to the Scottish Hate Crime Act wending its way through the Irish Parliament. The Northern Irish Parliament is about, I think, to publish a very similar bill to the Scottish Hate Crime Act. I wouldn't be at all surprised if a Keir Starmer-led Labour government bring forward a Hate Crime and Public Order England and Wales Act, which is identical to the Scottish Hate Crime Act. So I fear that even though the public's appetite for these sorts of draconian interference in their speech has never been lower, and polls in Scotland suggested that the Scottish Hate Crime Act is very unpopular. And of course, Humza Yousaf, the SNP leader, who piloted it through Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, as Justice Minister in 21, and who was the First Minister when it was activated on the 1st of April this year, he was gone 30 days after it had been activated. That wasn't the main cause, but it contributed to his diminishing authority. I mean, authority just started draining away from him as First Minister as soon as the Hate Crime Act was activated. People were ridiculing him, ridiculing the act. More reports were received by Police Scotland in the first few days of the act being activated about a speech Humza Yousaf himself had made in which he decried how few people of colour there were at the top of Scottish society back in, I think, 2021. More people complained about that speech than about anything else. He was made to look ridiculous because of his attempts to police what people were saying. So I hope that will be a lesson to other leaders. I hope to Keir Starmer that if they try and introduce a similar bill in the Westminster Parliament, that it'll get them into the same trouble it got Humza Yousaf. But politicians don't usually learn these sorts of lessons, unfortunately. And it's very unusual for politicians to do anything to reduce the scope and power of the police. On the contrary, they usually increase them.
Well, I remember when Dame Jacinda Ardern was asked a question, what exactly is hate speech? And her response was, when you hear it or see it, or words to that effect. And I thought, well, if that's so general, I'm not surprised those hate speech proposals were thrown out, frankly.
Yes. The problem with terms like misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech is that there is no consensus about what they are, about what they should be applied to. I mean, often we find ourselves defending feminists who stand up for sex-based women's rights in the UK. The UK Free Speech Union, if you look back at the 2,500 cases we've taken on over the past 4+ years. About 40% of them fall into the sex and gender category in our case database. That's gender-critical feminists getting into trouble in the workplace or at university for saying they don't think trans women are women, or for complaining about men, biological men who identify as women, competing against biological women in women's sports. Often when they misgender, quote unquote, a trans woman, they're accused of trafficking in hate speech. Kelly J. Keane, who got into trouble in New Zealand last year when she came to visit. She's a campaigning gender-critical feminist. She put up a petition on change.org asking the Oxford English Dictionary not to change its definition of woman from adult human female to something more trans-inclusive, which they were being urged to do. And because she had defined in this petition a woman as an adult human female, which is the Oxford English Dictionary definition, that petition was taken down, and she was told by change.org that was hate speech. So, hate speech may sound like something we should all rally to oppose. And Jacinda Ardern may say, you know it when you see it, but actually it's often just a way of describing a point of view you disagree with, of delegitimizing it, of trying to stigmatize it, because you don't want to actually have a proper argument. You just want to silence people you regard as heretics. And that's not how to go about bringing about political change in a mature democracy.
Toby Young, it's been a really insightful discussion. I've really appreciated your time. Looks like it's certainly a beautiful day in Auckland, not quite as nice here in Christchurch. I know you're travelling all around the country, and you can see Toby by going to the Free Speech Union's Facebook page and getting your tickets there. Toby, have a great day. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Chris. It's been a pleasure.